first moment, Professor Mário.
Leave my camera on?
No.
Yeah, I think she's going to introduce us, Lynn.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Today we are here with the roundtable, Critical Approach to Language Learning and Teaching towards a decolonial critique of language learning and teaching. And we have here Professor Dr. Laura Hamman-Ortiz, Professor Dr. Lynn Mário de Souza, and Professor Sávio Pimentel. At first, I'm gonna introduce you, Professor Sávio, because for me, it is really a pleasure to introduce Professor Sávio because of his importance for my career. He was my professor at UFBA when I was taking my master's degree, and he was also one of the special members of the board of my doctorate and master's degree. So he has followed me in order to help me. His guidelines have been of fundamental importance for my career as an English teacher and as a researcher. Well, but who is Sávio Siqueira? Sávio Siqueira holds a PhD in Languages and Linguistics at UFBA with a postdoctoral studies at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, Honolulu, United States, Associate Professor at the Institute of Letters at Federal University of Bahia, Permanent Professor of Postgraduate Programs in Language and Culture at UFBA, and in Letters at UFT Porto Nacional, Collaborating Professor of the Masters in Multilingualism, Education and Linguistics at Goldsmiths University of London. His lectures is entitled Critical English Language Teaching. It all starts with teacher education. Now, with you, Sávio Siqueira. Welcome here. And welcome all the professors that are here, all the lecturers. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you very much. Well, let me say good morning to everyone, especially to the members of this roundtable, my dear friend and colleague Lynn Mário and Dr. Laura that I just met. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. And in this, the third SIABRALITEC, which is, I think, as I can see, it congregates teachers of English from all the federal institutions in the federal system. So I will, as my topic says here, even though this is the roundtable refers to critical approaches to language learning and teaching, of course, I'm going to concentrate on English, but of course, this could be, I mean, it is valid for basically language learning and teaching. So I am wearing now the hat, among the many hats that we wear, the hat of a teacher educator. So then, as I can see, for example, I think it's almost impossible today to teach English, especially English, without being critical, even though we know it happens. So the topic is critical, what I'm calling critical ELT. It all starts with teacher education. So then I'm going to focus on this line, and I hope we can complement with other ideas and with the members of the roundtable. So this is my potential roadmap. I hope I can make it in 30 minutes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the audience and the context. So a little bit about the contemporary world, what I follow and consider English as a lingua franca and the implications, political and pedagogical implications. Then discuss a little bit critical ELT and teacher education, and move towards what we would currently refer to a decolonial English teacher education. or English teacher education in my conclusions. So when I was invited to this seminar conference, I didn't know about it, or at least I didn't know much about it. So then I took some time to observe, even though I'm very familiar with the Institutos Federais in the federal system, as I am part of this system. But I wanted to get to know better to the audience in the context. And because, of course, sometimes we think that the Institutos Federais or the federal institutes are limited to technical and professional education, but it's not. So then I believe it was a good, let's say, exercise for me to know the audience I'm talking to. So, and then I found out, for example, the whole federal system, it's a network of over 600 units of different natures, multi-campi spread around the country. So different courses for scientific, professional, and technological education, secondary and tertiary levels. So probably many English teachers, languages and literatures. We have areas of intense and robust research, teacher development extension programs and publications. And coincidentally, I found out that recently was one issue of the journal Leia Escola with the Universidade Federal de Campina Grande in Paraíba. So the latest volume is basically dedicated to this area of letras and languages in the Federal Institute. So then I can see that there is a lot going on in this context. Of course, the challenge here is to discuss critical approaches to ELT with very high qualified professional educators and colleagues. So then let me see if I can succeed. So I just want to begin reminding us of some characteristics of the contemporary world, and they're not new. We are all very familiar, and we are going to see the implications of this context. So if you look here, you're going to see a few things that I bring related to this contemporary world we live in. So we are talking about, for example, new educational demands and needs, tidal migration flows, mobility, diasporas, new sociolinguistic environments, super diversity, plurilingualism, polycentric norms, trans culturality, multiliteracies, multimedia, increasing translingual and transcultural orientation, decoloniality, plurilingual and multicultural classrooms, identity, issues of identity, ethnicity. So the whole world, what we see is we have all these characteristics that sometimes we don't take them into the classroom, the ELT classroom. So and then in regards to language, I'm going to use here a framework that this one in 2001 called the Global Language System, and he divided the languages. Of course, we can question this, but anyway, it's just a reference. So into 4 categories: what he calls peripheral languages, central languages, supercentral languages, and then he calls a hypercentral language, which is nowadays English. So there are 13, he considers 13 languages as supercentral, and the majority peripheral. Of course, this word is not a good word, but anyway, I'm going to concentrate on what he calls a hypercentral language, which is English. So then in this sense, in terms of language and in the context in the world, if we funnel into our linguistic discussion, I quote here Konchak when she says that communicative practices may not be easily categorized by language or speech community, but are rather emergent, performative, indexical, and often code mixed and multimodal. So it is a world where more and more we talk about translingual and transcultural competence, the development of critical language awareness, historical and political consciousness, as well as social sensibility. And she says that learners of foreign and second or additional language need less knowledge input, but more awareness raising regarding the contextual embeddedness of an exchange, more decoding practice for unexpected and non-standard interactions, and strategy training to compensate for the lack of shared background. And finally, she poses something that I agree with, which she calls the post-native speakerism era, exposition not only to varieties of pluricentric languages, but to non-native mixed code and allegedly imperfect productions, or what we would call imperfect productions of the language they are learning. So this is what we see in the contemporary world, and that sometimes, for some reason, we leave behind when we enter the classroom. So then in this context, we are, in a way, talking about the emergence of a global lingua franca, which is English, as we saw as the hyper-central language. And of course, this phenomenon is labeled different names. I am going to bring here English as a lingua franca, but of course, the phenomenon can be, let's say, investigated, analyzed through other perspectives, like world English is English as an international language, etc. So then a quick definition of English as a lingua franca, any use of English among speakers of different first languages and lingua cultural backgrounds, or another one, the discourse produced in interactions involving speakers of different first languages. And of course, I would say that it has to signal us that instead of placing emphasis on homogenization, English should be taken, analyzed, studied, and taught from the point of view of deconstructions and pluralities. And that's when I think critical approaches enter here, right? Okay. Very quickly, these are some characteristics of what we are calling global English as a lingua franca. So global uses, function, attitude, decentered, fluid, complex, emergent, hybrid, impure, translingual practices, so multimodality, critical, political, deeply intercultural, and of course, decolonial. So I, of course, thinking of the audience in this conference, and I know that many of our colleagues here will deal with the new national curriculum, and I just wanted to pinpoint here a few things to make us think that you know, this has to be approached from a critical point of view. So as you know, when it comes to the BNCC, so the new curriculum, national curriculum, there is the adoption of English as a lingua franca as the perspective. And then I quoted just a few sentences, 2 sentences actually. The treatment given to the component prioritizes the social and political function of English, thus consider its status of lingua franca. And to expand linguistic, multi-semiotic, and cultural repertoires, enabling the development of greater awareness and critical reflection about the functions and uses of English today. So then there is, in the BNCC, at least the theoretical part, a reference to English as a lingua franca in reference to criticality. And of course, we have been writing about this, and I have here a couple of articles that were recently published discussing this, the BNCC and the adoption of English as a lingua franca. And of course, we identified in the other colleagues what Ana Paula Duboc has called an epistemological conflict when it comes to theory and the let's say the materialization of of English as a lingua franca in the in the practicalities of the BNCC. And then she says here, I quote her, she says, how can a document embrace the creative, hybrid, and local uses of English in its lingua franca status if it organizes themes, objects of knowledge and skills linearly and hierarchically with examples of fixed and stable linguistic contents? So then for all my colleagues in the federal institutes who teach English for different reasons and different objectives, so this is a challenge, especially the ones that are going to deal with the curriculum, the national curriculum. So then, thinking of English language teaching, so talking about criticality is not something that I would say new. We know that. And I'm going to quote here, for example, Jean-Paul G. for 1994, when he says, whether they like or not, English teachers are at the center of the most crucial educational, cultural, and political issues of our times. And then he also says that teachers of English are not, in fact, teaching English, and certainly not English grammar or even language. Rather, they're teaching a set of discourse practices. So then, of course, Pennycook has mentioned this more than once, and other scholars and colleagues have mentioned that. So then, my question here is, based on all this, what does it really mean to encompass and encompass to be an English teacher today? So this is a question that I'd like my colleagues in the audience to reflect in thinking about your context. Not only, you as a teacher or as a teacher educator or even a learner of English in the past. So how are our classes to be conducted bearing such scenario in mind? And of course, as I mentioned before, in my view especially, it is next to impossible or absolutely incongruous to teach English uncritically nowadays. So of course, following different approaches, but I would say as a teacher educator in Brazil, in this context, especially thinking of decolonial studies and also thinking of all the changes that need to be made in our pedagogy. So I think it's almost impossible to, or incongruous to teach English uncritically today. So, and then I'm going to, let's see, oops, sorry. But anyway, what means to be critical? So being critical involves conscientization, reflection, disagreement, non-conformity, difference, dialogue, empowerment, action, transformation, hope. And of course, I draw this on Paulo Freire. When we talk about critical pedagogy, it's teaching for social justice. And believe it or not, even though we are talking about critical approaches here, I think it's important to enforce this because for some reason, I think ELT in many contexts is still conducted, based on traditional tenets of neutrality, native speakerism, etc., etc. So I think it's also important to call attention to what we call critical language pedagogy, which aims to have students develop a critical conscious understanding of their relationship with the world. This means, as Pennycook says, the classroom is not a closed box. So the classroom is the real world. And that's why we have to try, it's our role as teachers to deconstruct what we have been used to having in many situations, what I call a pedagogical Disneyland, where life is beautiful, everybody travels, everybody is rich, there is, we don't have any problems, the issues are very, they have nothing to do with people's reality. So this is something that we need to deconstruct with our critical approaches. And of course, the last one, which is critical align the development of communicative skills with skills which involve the development of a critical consciousness about the world and about acting upon the world, aiming at improving people's living conditions. So why am I teaching English? What I want, my students to reach, or what I'd like my students to reach with this powerful cultural, let's say, good that they are learning, right? So, and finally, which is, the point of this presentation, critical language teacher education, which aims at relating micro relations of applied linguistics to macro relations of social reality, and tries to problematize not only the inequitable relationships of power and social reality, but also this whole idea of language neutrality. As I say, there is nothing neutral in language, nothing neutral in language teaching and learning. And then I have some questions here. What can we say about English teacher education in this whole process, right? And teacher educators, because sometimes we, we teacher educators, especially the ones like me, working, more often with pre-service teachers or future teachers, sometimes we want our teachers to be critical when we are not critical, right? So then I pose here another question. What type of changes and updates are necessary, not only in teaching in LT, but also in teacher education? And then I say, based on my experience, and of course I cannot generalize, that in fact, the education of this new teacher, in quotes, of course, implies, above all, the destabilization of educators' comfort zone. I sometimes, well, I've been saying this for some time, that critical educators also need to go through this, this whole relearning that I'm going to talk a little bit about this later. So in order to think of this new teacher or this future teacher based on this world that I have just discussed here. So another question that I think is important is, how can we expect our teachers to be critical, as I said, if we are not critical or act critically in our teacher education classes, courses? If our curricula, for example, and programs have remained practically the same over the years, and then we say, oh, we want teachers to be critical, we want our students to be critical. But anyway, and how about me, the teacher educator? So then I think this quote here is interesting by Denzin Lincoln when they say, scholars have the responsibility to do work that is socially meaningful and socially responsible, politically informed, inquiry committed to praxis and social change. And then I think that's why it all starts, in my opinion, with teacher education, both pre-service and in service. Of course, in service, the teacher, in continuous education, more mature, more experienced, will be able to grasp a few of these things and potentially change. But I think it's crucial to, to work these issues with pre-service teachers, with, novice teachers or teachers to be, in order to think of or at least conceive, the education of a teacher that is really critical of what he or she is doing in the classroom. So that's why drawing on decolonial theories and studies that Lynn, Mário probably will talk about this, and also drawing on Catherine Walsh's elaborations, I see teacher education as a spaces for learning, to unlearn and relearn. And then just to make clear, learn means experience, habit creation, and reinforcement. Unlearn means challenge existing knowledge, make room for novelty. And relearn, make new connections, realign directions, etc. Right? So then Walsh says, we under this this whole perspective, we have to relearn, but not universally, but pluriversally, on different grounds. denaturalize and question singularity, particularities, and universalities of thought, unlearn truths and constructs of colonial mentality, what she calls unlearnings foster relearnings concerning new forms of thinking, knowing, feeling, and being in the world. As a teacher, and of course, if I am, imbued in these let's say, reflections, I'll be able to pass this on to my new teachers or my teachers, in service programs, and of course, they'll be doing this as a cycle with their students. I think I'm almost done. So, and then I say that, in fact, in talking to teacher educators, out of my experience, and this is a criticism that I usually make, and of course sometimes I think about myself. So then, in fact, we English teacher educators are sort of lost, because it's a lot of information, a lot of changes, in the whole world, keeps moving, and sometimes we don't follow because it's not good to be out of the comfort zone, right? So our sort of teacher educators are sort of lost and rather surprised with a very complex current reality, which has been demanding language teacher qualifications founded on bases, practices, conceptions, tools, and strategies that are very different from those we still use, even being aware that several of them have proven to be obsolete and outdated. So then sometimes we are aware of these changes, but it's uncomfortable to accept change and to try to go into this process of unlearning and relearning. So then I like this quote by Stroud, when he says that we are to prepare teachers to promote pedagogies that engage students in different ways of knowing and experiencing language and learning, and encourage them to use the full range of their own linguistic and semiotic resources. So then we have expanded this whole idea of even of the nature of language, right? And then in this world of where monolingualism is basically an exception. So the more we study this, the more we do research on this, we see that we talk about linguistic and semiotic culture, resources or repertoires, so as to articulate their thoughts, desires, fears, and imaginings. So then, approaching ELT critically, I would say, I have a few questions here to pose. I'm not going to comment, so then, because we don't have the time, I'm almost finished. But anyway, not only for teacher educators, but especially for teachers, when they look at what they're doing and what it means to be an English teacher nowadays. So some of these questions are interesting to be thinking about. For example, which political, ideological, and epistemological grounds am I going to conduct my practice? Which beliefs to revise and or deconstruct? Which conception of language to prevail? Language as a system, language as social practice, etc. Which materials are the most appropriate to the current reality, right? To my local reality? Which literatures, for example, in English, literatures in English, not English literatures, to explore in class? Which cultures, which accents, which worlds, English speaking or not? Which practices and models to be questioned or expanded? Which curricular updates, revisions, new versions? Which assessment systems to adopt, to create, to dump? Which dialogues to establish with peers? Which pluralities to assume? Which another pair of lenses to put on, or which other pairs of lenses to put on? And which promises and postures and mentalities to decolonize? And since decolonization here would be a, let's say, keyword, and I'm sure Mário will talk about this later. So based on Borelli, Silvestre, and Pessoa, I have here just a few, let's say, things that they say about how can we think of a decolonial teacher education, not only English, but language teacher education. So, and then I'm going to list them here. Recognize our praxis as political, confront the logic of coloniality, reflect on the interests we are serving, right? Think and act locally, decenter knowledge, production, and validation, emphasize affection, relations, and subjectivities, so not objectivities, neutrality, etc. Cherish community, plurality, and collaboration, submit to other worldviews, attempt to think and live teacher education otherwise, unlearn the unlearned, and challenge the epistemic structures of coloniality, and reflect and act upon the types of knowledge we privilege in our lessons. So then, in order to give an example, especially for those that could say, well, how would we, in many ways, put this into action? This is just an example. And talking about what we privilege in our lessons, one thing that I think that we, and I've been talking about this, take as you know, going, confronting the coloniality is deconstruct the plastic world of textbooks. So, and I have here two quotes. As you can see here, this is the plastic world of textbooks where the queen is always there. And of course, New York, Disney World, etc., etc. Nothing against the queen, nothing against New York. But anyway, they're always there, right? So this is the world that's always there. And then I like this quote by Perdomo when he talks about this. He says, we often behave as if our students on entering our little EFL world change utterly into little John or Janet Smiths. That coming to learn English, they have their three-dimensional humanity outside. They leave their three-dimensional humanity outside and enter the plastic world of textbooks, where language is safe and innocent and does not say or do anything. And then I have also this very interesting quote by Penny Cook in 2001, when he says, many ESL textbooks still work with the 1970 Kellogg's cornflakes vision of the family, a blonde, white, heterosexual family with one daughter and one son, all of whom clearly visit the dentist regularly. So then this has been here forever, and only critical teachers really will be able to, confront this reality. And finally, I think I would like to conclude saying that there are many examples within the system of Instituto Federal. I know several teachers and professors doing interesting critical work. And I'd like to just point out here two of them. One is this Critical Teaching Times, which is a podcast series by Leonardo da Silva from Instituto Federal de Santa Catarina in São José, and our colleague Priscila Farias from Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, and you can see the link there. They have produced several episodes of, with different scholars. I don't know if Lynn has participated, but many of our colleagues have, and it's available for you to have a look at and enjoy. It's a doctor from the Instituto Federal de Santa Catarina. And I also would like to mention this from one of our PhD students, Joelma Santos, and she is also a professor at Instituto Federal de Simões Filho here in Bahia, and she's been producing not only teacher education courses, but also wonderful material on ethno-racial materials in ELT. And I'd like to, thinking about what we've been doing in Brazil about critical materials and English as a lingua franca. I leave here the covers of these two books, Perspectivas Críticas do Brasil. That was this book was organized, edited by Valquíria Montmore and Rosane Pessoa from Universidade Federal de Goiás, and Valquíria from USP. And this one, which is English as a Lingua Franca in Teacher Education, a Brazilian Perspective, that was published in Berlin, but with all the authors from Brazil and experiences from Brazil, including a couple of colleagues also from Institutos Federais. So then, as you can see, there's been a lot, going on in terms of critical approaches, criticality, critical teacher education in our country, and I think we should investigate see more of this. Finally, to finish, really, I'd like to end with this quote by Bell Hooks, which is an author that I'm sure everybody knows, and a Freirean author, from her book, Teaching to Transgress. And this has a lot to do what we are saying, we are going to discuss here. She says, teaching in a traditional discipline from the perspective of critical pedagogy means that I often encounter students who make complaints like this. Like, I thought this was supposed to be an English class. Why are we talking so much about feminism? Or they might add race, class. I learned to respect that shifting paradigms and sharing knowledge in new ways challenges. It takes time for students to experience that challenge as positive. So I think this is it. Thank you very much, and I hope I have kept the time. Thank you, and this is these are the references. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sávio Pimentel. It was really great to hear you again, and this is very, very challenging and demanding, but at the same time, it's enlightening. So I think to be provoked, but to see some perspective, some ways of going, and I'm quite sure everybody who's watching and commenting are very happy with your talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. All the questions will be asked by the end of the three presentations of this roundtable, okay? So if you have your questions, please keep on asking them on the chat on YouTube, and we're gonna ask all of them. So Sávio will come back at the end along with Professor Lynn Mário and Professor Laura Hamman, and then we will open for questions, okay? So, so now I'm going to introduce our next talk. All right, that's good. I'm going to introduce our next panelist, which will continue this roundtable. Her talk is Softening and Transcending the Boundaries of Language, a Critical Reframing of English Language Teaching, by Dr. Laura Hamman-Ortiz. She is a postdoctoral research associate in the program of Equity, Bilingualism, and Biliteracy in the School of Education at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She also holds a faculty position with the English as a new language program at the University of Notre Dame. Her research is situated in the intersection of applied linguistics and education, with a focus on the translanguaging and biliteracy practices of emergent bilingual students and their teachers. Dr. Hamman-Ortiz began her career as a K-12 educator in the United States and Chile, which informs her current work supporting pre-service and in-service teachers in designing more culturally and linguistically sustaining classroom. Dr. Laura Hamman-Ortiz is sponsored by the U.S. Embassy and Consulates in Brazil and the United States Department of English Language Specialist. So please, you have the seat, Dr. Laura Hamman.
Thank you so much, Gisvaldo. Good morning, everyone. I'm so honored to be here to be able to join this roundtable with distinguished colleagues, Sávio and Mário. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to share some of my thoughts around how we think about language and language speakers and some of the implications of these ideologies for English language education. And yes, I'm coming to you from Colorado, and I'm excited to be able to engage with all of you in the question and answer portion around how some of these ideas that I've been playing with and thinking about in my context here in the United States intersect with pedagogical practices and ideologies that you're thinking through in Brazilian contexts. Before I begin, I also want to thank the U.S. Embassy and Consulates in Brazil for inviting me to speak with you today, and also the SIABRALITEC conference organizers, especially Gisvaldo, and thank you for that introduction. So as Gisvaldo mentioned, I'm an educational linguist at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I began my career as an English language teacher in the U.S. and in Chile, and now for the last decade or so have worked supporting pre-service and in-service teachers. And so I think a lot about what it means to create critical spaces for language education and to support teachers in doing this work as well. Today I'll be focusing specifically on what it means to critically reimagine language, language speakers, and language education with this framing around softening and transcending the boundaries of language. So I'll draw upon some examples from my context, but I think these critical ideas extend to many contexts around Brazilian ELT as well. All right. So here's where I'm hoping we can go today, my roadmap in the time that we have together. I want to begin with a little bit of historical background around the inventing and standardizing of language, and then move to two lenses that have been really fruitful for my thinking around reframing language and language speakers and language learners. So I'll talk a little bit about radiolinguistics and then also translanguaging theory. And then I'll end with a couple of implications. Thinking about how some of these different theoretical lenses can then change the way that we think about English language education in the classroom and the preparation of English language educators. All right. So to begin, I think it's important to recognize that the idea of national languages, such as English or Portuguese or Spanish or Mandarin, is an invention. We know that since the earliest human society, since the earliest civilizations, bilingualism and multilingualism has been present. And we know that the majority of the world is multilingual. However, the study of bilingualism and multilingualism didn't begin until the construction of the nation state in late 19th century Europe. And so at this time, linguistic heterogeneity was seen as an impediment to developing a nation. And thus the concept of a national language began presented as a way to unify these imagined communities or these new nations that were being created. And so the use of a national language was encouraged, it was incentivized, and in many cases it was mandated. And through colonization, these language ideologies spread throughout the world. So normalizing monolingualism for the national subject and normalizing this notion that there is a bounded language that is connected to different nations around the world. And it's important to recognize that history first as we think about what it means to talk about language and to bound language. This historical emergence of national languages has extended to the way that we think about and talk about language. Noam Chomsky, a renowned linguist in the 1960s, defined language as a system of abstract structures in the mind of an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community. So there's been, for many years, this idea that language is something that we can clearly study outside of its context, and that there are these ideal speakers, native speakers who exist in these supposed homogenous communities that use this language. And so I want to push us a little bit to think about who is this ideal speaker? What does it mean to be a native or an ideal speaker of a language? And where does this homogenous speech community exist? And I think Brazil is a wonderful context for thinking about this, because in Brazil and in the United States, there are very few places where you would encounter a community where there are no diverse linguistic practices, whether from other languages or other dialects, regional ways of engaging with language. So really kind of pushing against this standardization of language. And yet what we see is that the standard language ideology persists. And I love this definition by Rosina Lippi-Green, where she defines a standard language ideology as a bias toward an abstracted, idealized, homogeneous spoken language, which is imposed and maintained by the dominant block institutions, and which names as its model the written language, but which is drawn primarily from spoken language of the upper middle class. And I think it's important to recognize that that there really is no such thing as a standard language, that the idea of a standard language, or the myth of a standard language, is designed to obscure the complex power dynamics that are at work to ensure that standard continues to reflect the practices of the upper middle class. And this is true across all languages, across all cultures, that what is standardized is one form of that language that then becomes bounded and treated as the norm, but really is generally drawn from the language practices that match that of the upper middle class. And if you're not familiar with her book, English with an Accent, it's a fascinating read into how English has been constructed, particularly in the US context, and standardized, ignoring all of the different varieties of English that exist. So to that point, I want us to think about whose linguistic practices then are legitimized by the myth of the standard language, and who's become marginalized. All right. In recent years, this idea of language as a bounded and a standardized object has begun to be pushed and reframed. And Sávio touched on some of these ideas as well, in thinking about how scholars and teachers are beginning to rethink the way that we consider and talk about language speakers and language learners. And so I want to talk about three framings, contemporary framings, that I've seen as broad trends across the field of language education. So first, in the last few decades, there's been an increased push to see language as social practice. So many have argued that we can't understand language outside of situated contexts of use. So talking about language as a system of abstract structures isn't helpful if we don't actually think about how language is being used, because language does not exist as a separate entity. It only exists through social practice. Another lens that moves into a more critical space is thinking about language as a social construct. And so this line of argumentation questions language itself and argues that all named languages, like English, Portuguese, Mandarin, Arabic, are social inventions. So the idea of a bounded language is a social invention. And so this view seeks to blur the boundaries that we've placed around named languages, and some scholars have called for a more radical disinventing of language, like Sinfrey McConey and Alistair Pennicook. And finally, there's been a move to see language through an intersectional lens, recognizing that language operates in conjunction with other aspects of identity, including class, race, and gender, among others. So to understand language, we also need to consider how these intersecting aspects of identity shape how language is used and also how language is perceived. So building upon these three framings of language, I'd like to share two lenses that have helped me to critically reframe language and language speakers in my own work, and then talk a little bit about how these lenses can be useful for English language teaching contexts. The first, we'll start with ratiolinguistics. All right, so in the field of linguistics, ratiolinguistics is a fairly new area of study, and it's one that's dedicated to exploring the intersection of race and language. This approach argues that people's language experiences are intertwined with their racial experiences. Thus, we can't understand language unless we're also looking at how languages are raced and how races are languaged, how there's an intersection between the two, considering racial identities and systemic patterns of racism. And one of the areas that ratiolinguistics explores is how dominant groups achieve linguistic hegemony by marginalizing the linguistic practices of non-dominant groups. And here I'd like to share a quote from Terence Wiley, who argues linguistic hegemony is achieved when dominant groups create a consensus by convincing others to accept their language norms and usage as standard, when they can convince those who fail to meet those standards to view their failure as being the result of the inadequacy of their own language. So thus, part of the larger project of linguistic hegemony is convincing those who fail to learn or use the so-called standard language that it's their fault for failing, rather than recognizing the systems and structures that are in place that establish one group's language practices as the so-called standard. For this reason, in the US and the United States context, many scholars such as Django Paris have shifted from using the term standard American English to dominant American English, to explicitly acknowledge that there's nothing standard about American English, but it's the language of the dominant group within society. One example of linguistic hegemony in action in the context of the United States is the ongoing delegitimization of African American English. In the 1970s, there was a movement in the US to better understand the structure and the lexicon of African American English. And here you see a few of those seminal ethnographic works that looked closely at language use of African American communities, Language in the Inner City by William Labov, and Talking and Testifying by Geneva Smitherman. And so we've had decades of research looking at African American English, and all of the studies have confirmed that African American English, like so-called standard American English, is a highly developed, rule-governed linguistic system, and that Black students need Black language to communicate with their families and communities. It's the language of their home. And yet, in schools, African American English continues to be stigmatized and framed as bad, lazy, or incorrect English in many classrooms. So we see this tension between our knowledge base and then within classrooms, this ongoing delegitimization of African American English. And just out of curiosity, I wanted to see what ideas around race and language were present when we think about native English speakers. And it was interesting to hear Sávio talk about the plastic world of textbooks and the representations of English language speakers within textbooks. But I've also found that it extends beyond textbooks and into the contemporary world. So I Googled, for example, native English speaker, and here are just a few of the images that came up. Images of smiling white men and women, many holding or displaying a national flag. So even within the public consciousness, there's still this pervasive ideology of native English speakers looking a particular way, or white specifically, and denying the reality that native English speakers are a diverse group stretching across many nation states comprised of a range of people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So today I also want to kind of push this idea of how we think about who's legitimized as a native English speaker and what sorts of representations of native English speakers we're using within our own classrooms. All right, so here's what I see as some key takeaways from ratiolinguistics as we think about language education. First, ratiolinguistics reminds us that named languages are not neutral. They reflect the language practices of typically white dominant groups when it comes to English in particular. So recognizing that fact as we think about English language pedagogies. Also, it's important to recognize that in any language, certain speakers are legitimized and others are marginalized. And I think it's important to interrogate who is being privileged when we think about languages and language groups. And there's also a tension between assimilationist and anti-racist language education pedagogies. And these terms come from Ibram X. Kendi's distinction between those who think that in order to have equity and social progress, everyone should assimilate, and those who believe that we need to hold anti-racist stances toward that type of mentality. And so an assimilationist belief would argue that all students need to learn standard English or standard American English in my context, that those who speak other dialects need to learn how to code switch. And an anti-racist belief would argue that students' home languages should be valued and validated in the classroom, and that students need to be engaging in these critical analyses of language and power. And then English language teachers, as a result, should be creating spaces for students to do that. And I think it's very telling. The image that I chose is from a Black Lives Matter protest in the United States. And April Baker Bell, who's a critical language scholar, has pointed out that even the ability to learn and master standard American English doesn't prevent racist actions. So I think we need to recognize that language itself and this idea of assimilation is not a panacea for inequities that exist both within my country and around the world. And so she had mentioned in her recent book, she said, when Eric Garner was being suffocated in a chokehold by New York City police, his last words were, "I can't breathe," which we've now seen in many protests around the United States and around the world. And that's certainly standard American English, but didn't prevent the racially motivated police killing. And so recognizing this intersection of language and power, and that it isn't, that we can't just assimilate in our thinking around language if we really want to achieve more equity in our schools and in our society. All right, so I'm going to move to translanguaging theory, which is something that, a theory that I've been thinking a lot about in my own work with bilingual learners as a way to reframe the way that I understand language and how I understand bilingualism and bilingual learning. And I imagine some of you are familiar with translanguaging theory, as I know it's become a popular lens for teachers to think about language pedagogies as well. So just to give some background, translanguaging is a sociocognitive theory of language, and it's rooted in two central principles. Translanguaging theory argues that the bilingual or multilingual mind is one holistic repertoire, and that bilingual and multilingual practice is dynamic. And so some of the things that translanguaging seeks to do is to soften and transcend national language boundaries, like those that I was speaking about at the beginning, and to challenge monolingual orientations for thinking about bilingualism. And translanguaging also seeks to validate the dynamic ways that bilingual and multilingual students leverage their dynamic resources for making meaning. And so I think it's important to think about what this theory means in the context of ELT as well. So we'll talk a little bit about these kind of two components of translanguaging theory. So on one hand, translanguaging theory is a theory of the bilingual mind. So translanguaging seeks to argue that the bilingual brain is not two monolinguals in one person, with one language and acquiring a second language, but rather understanding the bilingual mind as a single system with diverse language features. Another way, so in this image, you see kind of this idea that the bilingual mind has separate places for each language, whereas translanguaging argues that there's one holistic repertoire containing all of an individual's linguistic knowledge. Another way to think about this distinction is seeing translanguaging as the inside view of the bilingual mind, whereas recognizing named languages is an outside view. And Ofelia Garcia and Joanne Klein described this idea, saying the term translanguaging should be taken in terms of transcending, going beyond the two named languages of bilinguals, to think of bilinguals and multilinguals as individuals with a single linguistic system, the inside view, that society, the outside view, calls two or more named languages. So recognizing that individuals might speak different named languages, or it might seem like they're using different named languages, but in reality, their linguistic repertoire is holistic and comprised of shared linguistic knowledge from their experiences. All right, translanguaging theory is a theory of the mind, but it's also a theory of practice. So translanguaging argues, or translanguaging represents the multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual worlds, which is a quote from Ofelia Garcia, who introduced translanguaging theory and has continued to theorize and think about what translanguaging means for pedagogical contexts. And so in this context, translanguaging represents the diverse ways that people make meaning, and bilingual and multilingual people move across languages as they're communicating. And the last few decades have seen a wealth of research looking at what translanguaging looks like in practice, and thinking about what that means then for pedagogy in context, in bilingual context, but also in English language teaching context. So here's just one very short example from a study that was done by UFBA Garcia and some colleagues looking at bilingual learners in a kindergarten classroom. And so she showed in this study that students are constantly moving between languages because they have one holistic repertoire. And so as they negotiate meaning, we often see students leveraging both parts of their entire repertoire to do so. So this was a kindergarten student who was counting pumpkin seeds in a math class, and he was saying, thinking aloud, I have 25 y I need dos más, no tres. Look, I have only 23 now, 25, I need dos. So he's going back and forth, leveraging English, leveraging Spanish as he's counting to 25 and adding more pumpkin seeds. And this is typical in bilingual classrooms. This sort of language mixing, or so-called language mixing, is typical in bilingual communities. So translanguaging theory really wants us to recognize that flexible languaging is not a sign of confusion. It isn't an error, but it's the way that many bilinguals and bilingual learners leverage their entire linguistic repertoire as they negotiate meaning. All right, so some of the key insights then from translanguaging theory are that bilingualism is not double monolingualism, that language mixing is a normal part of bi and multilingual communication and learning, and that students benefit from the opportunity to draw upon their entire linguistic repertoire in the classroom. So now I'd like to take a moment to think about how some of these different components of ratiolinguistics and translanguaging impact the English language teaching classroom. What should we take away from these insights around language? And I know I have about 5 minutes, so we'll see if I can touch on all three of these. One is around representation, issues of representation. So thinking about how does acknowledging that English is a social construct and English speakers are a diverse group change the way that we think about linguistic representation in the classroom. A second is identity. How does viewing students as emergent bilinguals, not just as students acquiring English, change the way that we think about students' linguistic identities? And finally, how does viewing bilingualism as a power-laden and dynamic practice change the ways that we structure English language pedagogy? So I'll start with representation, and Sávio touched on this as well. And for those of you who teach English literature, who use English literature, one important aspect of reframing representation is decolonizing the canon or the literature that we're using to represent diverse Englishes and diverse perspectives. And so here's some traditional texts that are used in many English language teaching classrooms, and really pushing away from some of these texts like Romeo and Juliet, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, to thinking about texts that are written by Black authors, for example, or that feature African-American English or other varieties of English, such as Invisible Man, Beloved, Octavia Butler's recent book, Kindred. There are ways to go a little bit more deeply into not only what language is, but also representations of race at the intersection of language. Another way to think about representation is to consider who is being presented in your textbooks and in your classrooms as a native English speaker. We know that native English speakers are a very diverse group. So thinking about the representation of a traditional native English speaker and how you can push back against some of these ideologies of the plastic world of textbooks, the Kellogg family, like Sávio talked about, to have more diverse representations. For identity, I want to share a practice that I've used in my work when I'm working with students and with pre-service teachers to explore what it means to understand students' identities from a more dynamic perspective. And I think it's so important that we recognize that our students enter the classroom with these dynamic identities, and as they're acquiring English, they're bringing these diverse and dynamic identities with them. And so this is one activity that I've done as a way to understand what students' identities are, their linguistic identities are, and how they understand those different components of their identity intersecting. So this is called a language portrait, and it involves two components: having students list the languages that are part of their identity, and then having students map those languages onto their body or their drawing of a body. So just to give you an example of what this looks like, this is with some younger learners. So a 4th grade student and a 2nd grade student. And what I've learned from engaging in this work with young learners is that students have diverse and flexible understandings of their own identities, and they connect to their linguistic identities in really unique ways. So in this example with Sophie, the student is a 4th grade student who's half French, half Swiss, attending a Spanish-English bilingual program in Mexico. And so she very literally put the languages that she speaks in her mouth. She colored her mouth with the colors for Spanish, for English, and for French. And then figuratively assigned English to her feet because she's found that English allows her to travel and speak to people all around the world. So even young students are developing these understandings of what languages are a part of who they are and what language can enable them to do. And so kind of bringing that more to the forefront when we think about language learning spaces. This other student, Emma, who's a 2nd grade student in the US, learning in English and Spanish, used her language portrait to show that she identifies strongly as an English speaker, an English dominant speaker, but she recognizes Spanish as part of her academic learning, something that she writes, a language she writes in, that she thinks in. And she also added Portuguese, although she has Portuguese heritage but doesn't speak the language because it's an important part of her ethnic identity. And she assigned Portuguese to her soccer shorts because she likes Brazilian soccer and also plays soccer. And so students here are really negotiating a sense of what it means to think about your linguistic identity and showing that languages are not split in the bi or multilingual body, but really only exist within context of use. All right. I have an example of a pre-service teacher as well engaging in this exercise. So this is something you can do with older students as well to think critically about language and the languages that are part of our identity. I'm going to move to the last section. So finally, with pedagogy, thinking about reframing our pedagogies around these critical and more flexible lenses. So one important thing to think about in the English language classroom is to what extent are students able to do bilingualism or to leverage all of their linguistic resources in the service of learning. And some of the work that I've done in the US has been with elementary classrooms where I've worked with students to create bilingual products. And when students are having to create something bilingually, they're negotiating across languages, they're recognizing the subjective nature of translation and developing a deeper metalinguistic awareness across the languages that are a part of their repertoire. All right, and in closing with this final slide, we can also engage students in critical language analysis. And I just want to, I mentioned this scholar earlier, but April Baker Bell has an incredible book around linguistic justice that just came out this year, where she's looking at how to engage students in these types of critical analyses. So thank you. I look forward to talking with you further around what these theories can offer us in terms of how we think about language, and also thinking about what they then mean for us as English language teachers as we translate this way of thinking about language and language learners to our pedagogies. So thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you further. It looks like we can't quite hear you, Nadia.
Sorry to interrupt, Nadia, but we can't hear you. Nadia, we can't hear you. Okay, thank you very much, Laura. As Nadia is having some problems, some technical problems, I will take over from now on. So it was a very nice talk, and it's very interesting, and that's why we put the three of you together, because it's intertwined, right? Like there are some connections and some parts they overlap, but with different perspectives. So I'm more than happy with this round table. And to add to it, we now have Professor Lynn Mário Menezes de Souza, and his talk will be towards the colonial critique of language learning and teaching. Okay. So, Lynn Mário, I'm sorry, I'm gonna switch to English so that Laura can follow. Lynn Mário Menezes de Souza is a full professor at the University of São Paulo with a master's in applied linguistics from PUC São Paulo and a PhD in semiotics, also by PUC São Paulo, and a postdoctoral degree, Western University in Canada. His current research focuses on literacies, language policies, interculturality, and decolonial theories, with several publications in Brazil and abroad. The most recent ones are Theorizing the South, released in 2019, and Global Languages and Critical Intercultural Awareness, The South Answers Back, which was released last year in 2019. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lynn Mário de Souza. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Gisvaldo. Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for this opportunity of interaction with the public, your public specifically, and especially with my colleagues, Sávio and Laura. Well, it looks like I'm going to complement what they've said. Unfortunately, I hope I'm not going to repeat, but Sávio mentioned, both Sávio and Laura mentioned the importance of critique in language learning and teaching, and how critique looks at language from a different perspective. Sávio used the term epistemological, which is important when we're looking at the situation from a decolonial perspective, always connected to the ontological. I won't be using these on my slides, but I hope I remember to comment on them. Okay, so first I'd just like to say that in the context of decolonial theory at the moment, as decolonial theory is very much connected to contextualization and de-universalization, at the moment everything is decolonial. We see decolonial being used in a multiple number of ways. What is clear is that there are many ways of looking at decoloniality. There are many decolonial thinkers. So the way that I will present the decolonial theory is obviously just one interpretation, my own interpretation. But I'd like to begin by referring to what the Bolivian decolonial thinker Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui says, that she says that she's worried. She says decolonial theory has become a fashion. And she says where decolonial theory is a fashion, post-colonial theory is a desire for an end of colonization, and anti-colonial theory is a struggle, because it very clearly puts itself against colonization. Now this is a warning, like many other fashions. To what extent is decolonial theory serious or not? From the perspective that I see it, it is always political. It is always political. For me, it's no good doing decolonial theory because that's what everybody else is doing. When we say it's political, it means it deals with social injustice, inequality, and as politics, deals with multiplicity and change. So decolonial theory is not simply a way of thinking, it's a way of acting. It's a gesture towards social justice. Firstly, I'd like to begin with what is critique. We've used this, and I think it was Sávio who said that we've been doing critique in language teaching for so long, but it's still never enough because we've been doing it for so long and we still have those pictures in our classrooms of the Famiglia di Margarina or Kellogg's cornflakes, as Alistair Pennycook referred to. So what's happening here? I think it's always worth coming back to questioning what do we understand by critique. And I'll go back to Horkheimer, who in 1937 distinguished between what he called traditional theory and critical theory. And this was from the perspective of the Frankfurt School. And he says traditional theory aims at explaining and understanding, critical theory aims at critiquing and changing. So basically, traditional theory or traditional critical theory, we can say here, claims to be critical because it explains. Its objective is to help people to understand, but it explains basically the status quo. It helps us to understand the status quo, and it sees itself as critical because it doesn't rely on common sense. So it seeks to explain and understand by going beyond common sense. Now, critical theory, on the other hand, also aims at going beyond common sense, but more than that, it aims at not stopping at understanding, but changing our present understanding. So critiquing, from Horkheimer's point of view, involves revealing the hidden, or hidden meaning what is not apparent, what is not accessible to common sense, revealing hidden contradictions, self-interests, and distortions. This is what various modern thinkers have tried to do. Freud did this by putting things into our unconscious, which we are not aware of. Nietzsche talked about this and how we are dominated by the theories we are not really aware of. And Marx did this, revealing the hidden by saying that we are not aware of the ideologies that manipulate us. So critique has got to do with this revealing the hidden, the below the surface. But it doesn't stop there. It's got to go beyond this. It aims at change, and that's what critical theory does. In general, then, science follows the paradigm of traditional theory, because science helps us to explain and understand phenomena of nature. And the humanities, again, in general, follow critical theory. Okay? But again, as Lara showed in her, when she mentioned the teaching of literature, the humanities very often continues to teach literature canonically, maintaining the canon instead of attempting to change it. So, what then is decolonial critique? So, as critique, it involves revealing hidden interests and focuses on change. As decolonial critique, it looks at the present situation of Latin America as suffering from the ongoing effects of colonization, even though, for us, colonization ended nearly 200 years ago. So colonization, if we understand the term, what it means, involves the institutionalization of what we call the colonial difference. The colonial difference occurs when a group, one particular group, in this case, the European colonizers, invades and occupies a territory and then sees itself as superior to the group that already existed in that territory. So what colonization left us was with this continuation of the colonial difference, which established the superiority of the colonizer and the inferiority of the native who was then colonized. The colonial difference extends then this superiority to everything belonging to the dominant group. So it's not just the dominant, the colonizer as a person who is superior. It's everything that belongs to him. His culture, his language, his knowledge, his ethnicity, all of these are covered then by the permanence of the colonial difference, and that is the origin of racism that we're experiencing today. So in spite of the official end of colonization in Latin America, the colonial difference continues through the elites. Our elites in our independent nations, post-colonial nations, continue to perpetuate the colonial difference. This continuation of the colonial difference is what different thinkers of decolonial theory call coloniality, or what one particular thinker, the one I referred to previously, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, she calls it internal colonization. Internal colonization because it's colonization continued by local elites. Okay, now one of the things I'd like to say is that in colonial difference, it's not simply a question of promoting some as superior and others as inferior. It is also a question of extreme violence, because this violence of convincing, it's not convincing, of imposing superiority on others is, no words for it. It's violent, it's aggressive, it's convincing, that it results, its consequences, that the people who are treated as inferior see themselves as not existing, as invisible. So what then is decolonial critique? We've talked about the hidden decolonial theory as critique seeks to show the hidden aspects of colonization and the continuing aspects of colonization as coloniality. So having its origins in the colonial difference, coloniality involves the privileging of Eurocentric knowledges, languages, ethnicities, and the preference for reason, or what they call modernity. Reason involved the negation of the body and subjectivity, and the privileging of the mind and objectivity. Reason produced modernity and science. Reason worked by disconnecting the body and what they call the geopolitical location, meaning the space and the time, the space and the history that this body occupies. So it disconnects the body from the mind that thinks. And reason, in its preference for objectivity, focuses only on truth and knowledge as what is said, the enunciated, what is said by those on the dominant side of the colonial difference, and not who is saying. So when we get all the knowledge produced by those on the superior side of the colonial difference, not connected to their bodies, then this gives us the impression that this is the only natural form of thinking. Now, when those of us located on the other side of the colonial difference, on the inferior side, what we say and the knowledge that we produce always has an accent. Our knowledge will always be connected to our bodies. Our knowledge will always be local, whereas the knowledge connected to the dominant side of the colonial difference will always be universal, because there are no bodies. Their bodies are invisibilized in the sense of only what is said, what they say is emphasized. Our bodies are invisibilized, ours meaning on the inferior side of the colonial difference. Our bodies are invisibilized in terms of the knowledge that's given to what we say, right? But our bodies are marked as being inferior, and therefore the language that we speak is always has an accent. So even when we're learning a foreign language, from the colonial difference, the foreign language that we speak on the other side of, on the lower side of the colonial difference will always have an accent. As if there are some people who speak language without accents. But that is one of the effects of coloniality. So Western knowledge produced by hidden Western bodies became objective and universal. Western science became universal science, as if there are no other sciences in Africa and Asia, indigenous sciences in Latin America. The colonial difference then persists as coloniality. It continues to value Western knowledges, languages, and ethnicities, and continues to negate the existence of other knowledges, languages, and ethnicities. So if we just think, for example, of the universities that we belong to here in Brazil at the moment, we are part of the academic elite of the nation. Now, what bibliographies do we use? Right? What are the bibliographies in our libraries? So even when we produce, we publish, we are publishing in, we want to publish in journals that will have greater international circulation or international recognition. And what do we mean by international? We don't mean by international recognition by nations like Malawi or Swaziland in Africa. Of course, we mean by recognition by the former colonizers, or what in what we call globalization today, which is takes imperial dimensions, the global north. So it's recognition by the global north. As long as we continue in our subservience to this global north, we will maintain ourselves on the lower end of the colonial difference and perpetuate internal colonization or coloniality. Because we will continue to maintain our invisibility. And I said I'd come back to the terms epistemology and ontology. So if it's knowledges that are valued and not the bodies, then if ontology relates to being and epistemology relates to knowledge, then the question is, which comes first, right? Do we have being first, or do we have knowledge first? Obviously, in order to know, we have to exist, right? So it's not so obvious that ontology needs to be taken into account when we talk about knowledges and epistemologies. And this is very important because sometimes we make gestures in thinking that we are acting decolonially. We want to substitute one set of knowledges for another, but we don't take into account that the knowledges of bodies which were made invisible by the colonial difference, these knowledges will never be equal because these bodies were never recognized. So what we have to do is not simply substitute one epistemology for another. We have to change the colonial difference which characterize some bodies as superior and some bodies as inferior. And so Laura referred to the work of our North American colleagues, Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores. They talk about ratiolinguistics. I think here in Brazil, I work with racism and language. I prefer to talk about anti-racist linguistics rather than racial linguistics. So it's not just, the difference for me is that anti-racist linguistics is linguistics used in a political stance, in a political action of anti-racism. So it's not just, I'm not developing one more branch of linguistics, one more epistemology, which will end up being part of the canon of coloniality. Right? We have to remember that if we really want to be decolonial, we have to change the colonial difference, and this means changing that structure which produces indifference. Right? This is an important aspect of anti-racism. It's not sufficient to say I'm not racist or none of us are racist if we are still part of a structure that produces the inequality of which racism is a symptom. So I conclude this slide by saying if existence is not valued, then we cannot have equality. So we need to consider the ontological dimension of what we're talking about. So remembering then that critique involves revealing hidden interests and promoting change. Decolonial critique, and this is my particular, I'm not suggesting that this is what everybody should do, but this is my particular take on decolonial theory. For me, decolonial critique involves 4 steps. The first step consists of identifying coloniality, meaning identifying the colonial difference, identifying its claims to universality and superiority at various levels. In the textbooks that we choose, in the language that we choose, why do we think it's normal when we talk about learning foreign languages? It's almost obvious that we choose English. Why? Right? Obviously, the answer is it's connected to the process of colonization or imperialism, which exists on a global scale, which makes English the obvious choice and not Guarani or even Spanish or French or German. Right? English is in Brazil, in all our current legislation, the term foreign language means English. Right? It's time we question this, and by questioning it, we will identify the coloniality behind this. The next step is interrogating the coloniality encountered. Okay, now we found the coloniality which equates foreign languages with English. Right? Now we have to interrogate it. Is it justified? Does it promote equality and justice? Does it give the same space to all foreign languages? Does it assume that all speakers of foreign languages are equal? Obviously not, because one of the hidden consequences of us privileging English as the foreign language is we are maintaining the dominance, that is the colonial difference, the dominance of the native speakers of English. They can continue to be monolinguals, whereas the rest of us on the planet, we have to learn English besides our own languages. So we are the ones who have to be bilinguals or multilingual, maintaining the colonial difference of the monolingual speakers of English. So this is interrogating coloniality behind presuppositions in English language teaching. The third stage is interrupting this coloniality that we have encountered. Okay, so we've identified it, we've interrogated it, and what do we do to change it? So we have to, first, as I said, reveal the heterogeneity and plurality of languages, of knowledges, of ethnicities. We have to give value to local knowledges. We have to give value, and I'll talk about this further, what I mean by this. I'm not, please don't understand decolonial theory or what I'm saying about it as being one more gesture towards nationalism. Now that would be the other trap we could fall into. So we are critiquing universality, but we're not going, and we are calling attention to the local, but it's not to say we have to completely change from what was claimed to be universal to now what is claimed to be local, because then we end up in the fundamentalism of nationalism, right? We are putting blinkers on our eyes and saying nothing outside our own nation exists. No, what we are saying is that we have been treated as invisible and inferior by a tradition of inequality inherited from colonization. Now what we demand is to be treated as interlocutors. Right? So we have to promote the dialogue between the local and the so-called universal. And this is what some of these thinkers, in number 4, the final step of decolonial critique, we have to do critique from the other side of the colonial difference. So we have to be conscious that where are we speaking from? Right? We're speaking from the inferior side of the colonial difference. This means that let's think like I'm part of the academic elite at an elite university, so I'm using decolonial theory, but just a minute. If I really want to use decolonial theory, I must see myself as part of the inferior side of the colonial difference. How do I live with this? How do I change my practice by taking this into account? And here, I'm trying to bring this back into our contextualization as English language learners and teachers in Brazil. So what is a coloniality in English? We have to identify, interrogate what what do we mean when we say English is the global language? The language, English is the language of global science, or English is the language of science, things that we hear so often. We have to reflect on the coloniality in these, how they privilege one group of one language and one concept of science over others. They treat one language as being superior and all other languages as being invisible. So certainly English is the language of global dominance. No question about that. It maintains the global privilege of colonial monolinguals, as I've said. It perpetuates the colonial difference. The world uses, on the other hand, a plurality of languages. Science is produced in a plurality of languages. Even though in our own academies, and especially when we talk about internationalization, we see this, our government at the moment will give us more points if we publish in journals abroad, or journals, local journals which have greater recognition abroad. We can't run away from the fact that we have a huge production of science in Portuguese, which we read, from which we learn. We're proud to have our doctorates in Brazil, in Portuguese. Our students produce theses in Brazil. We have a long tradition of producing science in Brazil. So how can we think of this production, this local production, in dialogue with the universal production, and not being as not being simply an inferior variation, a photograph which is out of focus in relation to the very clear photograph, the portrait. So in this situation, do we do traditional critique or decolonial critique? Do we simply understand and maintain the colonial situation that we have, or do we interrogate and interrupt it? For example, now I'll give you some examples. Which English? We hear always the answer, North American or British. But as Sávio and Lara have pointed out before me, do we maintain this abstract, homogeneous view of English as a bounded universal language? Or do we try to look for a more decolonial perspective where we see language as local, plural, context-bound, connected to bodies? When I say connected to bodies, I mean located in time and space and in a context of colonial difference. We need to critique the colonial difference, which separates everybody into superior and inferior. We have to liberate the negated existence of other linguistic forms, of our English with our accents. We need to focus on repertoires, which again, Sávio and Lara have mentioned before. Repertoire is a bottom-up view of language. It looks at language as a series of practices on the ground, and not an idealistic view of language from above, which thinks of language in terms of standards or abstract grammars. Repertoires are agglomerates of linguistic and semiotic resources, multiple resources, which may include not only a variation of linguistic resources of English, but also an agglomerate of these resources together with resources of other coexisting languages. In our case, Portuguese. So our repertoires of our students will include, if we look at our repertoires of English, they will include Portuguese. How do we deal with that? We need to critique the existing preference for native speakers, native speaker English, native speaker everything. Also, native speaker materials. We still privilege imported materials. We still privilege native speaker certificates of proficiency. To maintain the concept of native speaker that doesn't exist because it's an abstraction, is to maintain the hidden body of coloniality that marks what Mignolo calls a colonial geopolitics and body politics of knowledge, which, in other words, privileges the bodies of some speakers and negates the existence of the bodies of other speakers such as ourselves. To maintain the native speaker as a model is to maintain the colonial difference. It maintains an existing inequality and imagined universality, and negates the existence of local possibilities, local speakers, local teachers, local resources, local requirements. So we need to bring the body back, and I'm finishing here. We need to bring the body back, and we need to mark the unmarked. What does this mean? Bring the body back is to bring in the context. We have to show that native speakers have a body, they're speaking from a specific context, and what they say is connected to their context. And we also have a body which is connected to our context. So the way we speak is always connected to our context, both them and us. This is marking the unmarked. The unmarked is what is considered to be the standard, the universal, the not variated, not variant. Obviously, nothing in language is standard or universal. Every language proceeds from a particular context, a particular set of bodies. Every language has an accent. So we need to de-universalize English language teaching in Brazil by focusing on the local context. So language is always somebody's local. And here I write it as some body's local. So given the continental size of Brazil and the extreme variation of needs and resources, perhaps a greater educational value, and Sávio focused on the concept of teacher education. This is important, and this is what I'm thinking of here. Perhaps a greater educational value may lie in promoting language awareness, what we call educação linguística, or what I've called letramento crítico, rather than promoting language competence. What does this mean? Language awareness promotes a critical perception of language, mother tongue, and other languages as contextualized, varied social practices, and approaches normatization as contextual, necessary because we need norms, but unjust. Normatization, is more necessary for written communication to guarantee minimal understanding across space, because the written texts are not connected to their producers anymore. But we have to remember that norms change, and they need to be under constant critical revision. Norms change and they vary. And so here I end. How can we interrupt the coloniality in our English language teaching? By bringing the body back, marking the unmarked, as I've said before, and by focusing mainly on language awareness in public educational policy. This is important because when we focus on teacher education, and when we remember that our country is continental size, we know that the reality of our country is that the great majority of teachers in public schools have not received adequate teacher education. Not only in the past, but they continue not to receive adequate teacher education. So rather than by removing the foreign language, as there have been gestures to do this in the past, okay, if foreign languages are so badly taught, people can't even pronounce correctly, then let's eradicate them from the curriculum. Rather than by doing this, we have to recuperate the importance of learning a foreign language in the sense of language awareness. This has an extremely important educational value of teaching teaching a respect for difference. It shows that people think, express themselves, and behave differently in different contexts. And this variation deserves respect. Respect is as important as correctness. Language is not just intellect and mind, but sensibility and body, as both my colleagues have mentioned previously. This does not mean anything goes in language. Once we talk about repertoire and we talk about taking the local into consideration, it doesn't mean that we are saying that anything goes. What we are saying is, instead of a single abstract language grammar, we have to show our learners that each context of language use and practice has its own grammar. These grammars are dynamic and change constantly and collaboratively. Language change doesn't come from top down. Sometimes it may do, but in general, language change is bottom up. It's collaborative. This respect for variation, difference, and justice contributes to interrupting coloniality. And for me, this is what would be this is what we can achieve through a decolonial critique of language teaching and learning in this country. Thank you.
Can you hear me well?
I can.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lynn. Excellent presentation. Unfortunately, the time is so little for many things to hear about you, about what you have been bringing for us. So we have some questions, and I'd like all of the presenters to be here with their cameras on. I only ask one question because there is no time for doing all of them, but okay, they have their email and you can ask them by email if I can't ask you all the questions here, okay? So is Sávio there? Yes, okay, all of you are here. I'm gonna start with a question to Professor Sávio. There are many, but I'll ask only one. Yeah, I don't know how I'll ask. So I'll ask about one of Osvaldo de Melo Marques. If what we are teaching is not primarily the English language, but a set of discourse practice, how can we foster critically without relegating the teaching of language proficiency?
Well, this is a good question, but I think Lynn's presentation responded a lot of this discussion. So, and of course, what Laura said, yeah, we have to, I think I'm going to, just because of time, just say that what we, actually the three of us said here, is not like anything goes. In an instructional environment, there'll be room, of course, for certain normatization, but we have to understand that we need to go beyond that. And then I think several aspects were mentioned here. So like translanguaging, translingual practices, so ideological, political aspects. So this has all to do with language learning. So I think it's important to remember that we are not teaching language, we're teaching much more than that. And that's basically what I think the three of us have mentioned this here. So we need to, taking advantage of Laura's lexicon, we need to reframe this whole thing, you see? So, and then it's discourse, we are teaching this. So because then, and also thinking of what Lynn just said brilliantly, we have many things to interrupt in language teaching, in language learning. So I think one of them or several of them have to do with this traditional or these traditional practices that have been here for such a long time. Yeah. Well, I don't know if the other colleagues would like to complement.
Sure, I can add on to that. I think you said it very well, but I agree. I think across the three presentations, we're really trying to speak back to any sort of kind of bounded or singular understandings of language and language learning, language learners. And I think Lynn Mario's point about marking the unmarked is so important. And I think that's what it comes down to is not just progressing through with the curriculum as is, with an understanding of language as a homogeneous entity, but really starting to push those boundaries. And I love this idea of really going from the bottom up. And there's so many ways we can do that with students and in our own lives. But I think it's really important that in order to interrupt these processes, there has to be some deconstruction. There has to be critical analysis of language and language systems, recognizing that language is not it's not an entity in and of itself, that it exists. I love this idea of it exists in people's bodies, right? And that those bodies are differentially positioned around the world and within Brazil, within different societies. And so I think really just continuing to push those boundaries in our thinking around English and English language education.
Mm.
Any comments, Professor Lynn?
Well, I think we've said a lot, but in relation to this, I would like to remember that the fact that our old patron Paulo Freire always said, begin with the local, right? Know who your students are, right? When he talked about his, what were they called? I forget the term he uses, palavras geradoras.
Yeah.
So where do we get these words from? The knowledge, the local knowledge of the learners who we are teaching to. So let us not think that we just teach English and our students are just there as elements of the background. They change because of the time, but what we are doing is always stable. No, we have to take them into account, and that's the importance of considering the bodies in the picture, right? Our students are changing all the time. Those of us who teach here in Brazil, we know that if you're teaching the same class in the morning, the public you have in the morning and the public you have in a night group are very different publics. If you then don't take into account that the public at night is tired after a whole day's work, their attention span is reduced. And if you think you can teach the same class that you taught in the morning to the group that you have at night, you're mistaken.
Yeah, since you are talking, Professor Lynn, I'll ask you a question. To what extent, then, would the phrase English as an international language be an expression of coloniality?
I think if Professor Rajan may have answered this already, right? It doesn't exist. English as an international language doesn't exist unless we use English in its plurality, and then we'll say English as international languages exists, right? So we have many people speaking English in different ways, right? It only becomes English as an international language when we impose some kind of normatization and standardization on this plurality of Englishes that is used around the world.
Excellent. Wow. And the one for Professor Laura, because I can't ask all of the questions here. Do you agree that the greater challenge to a language teacher is to put together language skills with critical thinking?
Put together language skills with critical thinking? Yes, I mean, I think something I tried to articulate a little bit with this tension between assimilationist and anti-racist pedagogies is just this tension that I know English language teachers face between teaching normalized ways of using and thinking about English and maintaining a critical stance. And I appreciated what Sávio mentioned during his talk, which is that English language teaching should be inherently critical. And I don't think it always is, but I think that there needs to be that critical lens if we truly want to push beyond the reproduction of the existing systems of power. I think in maintaining English as a neutral language, in talking about English as an international language, as Lynn Mário just mentioned, we're reifying English as opposed to deconstructing the ideologies that undergird English as an entity. So I think that is the challenge for English language teachers, and having taught English myself in different contexts around the world, I know that it's not easy to create those spaces, but I think it's necessary. And if we want to move towards transformative change, if we really see ourselves as critical pedagogues, we need to begin to deconstruct some of these ideologies.
As we don't have much time, I'll ask a question, do you make the comments, okay? It's a question for Osvaldo. How to foster critically teaching grammar, for instance, because people generally think on grammar. How to teach grammar critically if grammar, there are rules, something like this. It should critically permeate all language components. So I'd like you to answer this question. It can start Sávio, and then Laura, Lynn can complement.
I think we can start from Lynn.
From Lynn. Okay, Lynn, let's go.
Okay, why not? Yeah, I think it's an important question. It seems a bit silly, but it isn't, because it's important to understand that language is connected to context. And even when we're talking about language practices, we are talking about grammars. We're just saying we're talking about different kinds of grammars. So if language didn't have grammar, it wouldn't be language. We wouldn't be able to understand each other. So the important thing of a grammar, and please think of grammar in this sense, the important thing of grammar is commonality, is the sharedness of grammar. So grammar is what permits what I say to be understood by you, right? So that is the shared, whenever we use shared structures, pre-known shared structures, this is grammar. So we can teach grammar, and this comes from my experience growing up as a multilingual. You learn that you speak, you're breaking the rules if you speak one language in a context where that language is not spoken. So one thing that I would teach would be that in the same way as you talk to your friends in one way, you talk to adults and strangers in a different way. In the same way that you speak in one way, but you write in another, or you write in your personal texting means in one way, and then you write an essay for your school in another way, you are following different rules in different contexts for different kinds of texts. All of these are grammars. They're all important. Right? They all help to constitute what one text in one context means. So grammar is important, but if we're going to teach grammar as that abstract prescriptive grammar which claims it doesn't change in eternity, then I'm sorry, there's very little we can do critically over there apart from critique that grammar. Mm-hmm.
Will you talk? Will you say anything else?
No, I totally agree with Lynn. The thing is that we see grammar as this prescriptive grammar, so that's basically the challenge for teachers. So I like I've always thought of the idea of having grammars in the plural. So because then we know that teachers have this. It's the same thing when it comes to pronunciation. So then we follow these, let's say, pre-established dominant models, and then we don't go beyond that. So as Lynn says, so then we have to consider context, we have to consider different bodies, and we have to consider different contexts. So and also different uses, different objectives. So this involves all this shared different occurrences. So and it's challenging. The problem is that I've always said that being an English teacher nowadays is much more complex than when I began. When I began the teacher, I remember one of my first jobs. I didn't even get it to be interviewed. The person said, "Oh, do you want a job as an English teacher?" I said, "Yes." And then she said, "Okay, here's the book, teach it." And I did. I used the book the way, I just operated the system without being, without questioning all these issues. So this is it.
At the time, Sávio, students didn't ask that many questions, right?
Exactly. So then as we have, a whole different body of students, we need to have a whole different body of teachers and mentalities and everything. So it's much more complex than it was in the past.
Oh my. This meeting is so good, but time is over. I'll ask you to make your considerations. I thank all of you for this round table. It was very rich, and it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Yes, so I pass the microphone for you. in order to give your considerations.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was enlightening to hear my colleagues and also the questions. And I have to, thank Gisvaldo and you, Nadia, and everybody involved. And from the program, I could see that it's a pity. Yeah, it's a pity we are not, well, we couldn't be together in Ouro Preto, right? It would have been wonderful to be there. But, it's been great. So thank you very much for this invitation, and I hope we can meet in person soon, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, I'll just add, it's been a great honor to be able to be here, and I've learned so much just from being able to hear these brief presentations from Sávio and Mário, and so thank you for pushing my thinking as well, and I'm excited to take these ideas back with me as I continue thinking through these questions around critical pedagogy in relation to language teaching. And yes, thank you to Gisvaldo. And again, thank you to the U.S. Embassy and Consulates in Brazil for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished panel. And just to close with one final thought, I think that, I think we're in a space where we're continuing to pluralize ideas around grammar and discourse. And so I just think it's so important for English as English is, to continue to push that further and deconstruct the different ways in which people are positioned in relation to English language teaching. So thank you, and I'm honored to have been able to be part of this today.
Professor Lynn?
Thank you again. Thank you, Gisvaldo, for this invitation and it was problematic, all the changes that had to come through. And thank you, Sávio and Laura. There have been a lot of exchanges, and it's weird. I never cease to be surprised how, even when we haven't prepared these interactions before, how much convergence there is. And now I'd just like to end with one final thought in relation to critical pedagogies and critical teaching. One term that often comes to mind when we look at critical pedagogies is the idea of emancipation, right? And when we think of social justice, we think that we have to fight for equality, right? Which doesn't exist at the moment, but at some stage of time it will exist. Now, I like the idea, again, which some decolonial thinkers refer to, not all of them. Again, I'll recuperate the name of Silvia Kusikanki, and the French thinker Jacques Rancière, when he says, let's remember that equality is the point of departure, not the point of arrival. So the problem that has led us to inequality and social injustice is that we don't see equality as the point of departure. We don't consider ourselves equal. And so we think that we can emancipate by bringing people to equality at the end of a process. They suggest the opposite. If we really want to talk about social justice and equality, we have to see each other as equal right from the start. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lynn. Your talks are all connected. I think you have lots to reflect about after this presentation. Now I give you Gisvaldo to finish this presentation. Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Okay, it was a great pleasure to hear all of you, and I've done lots of thinking about it, and it was really great. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so I would just like to thank you very much. Then we can have a little small talk here, but we have to disconnect right now. And we'll be back at 10 to 2 with another roundtable, this time with members from SIABRALITEC, okay? And they're going to discuss some very major practical questions related to English language teaching in Brazil, especially in our network. So thank you very much. Everybody have a nice lunch, and we'll be back 10 to 2.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.